And to achieve that mission, we have three goals. We are the Museum of We the People, and thanks to the generosity of our friend and guest tonight, David Rubenstein, we are able to display rare documents like this magnificent stone Declaration of Independence, which you're going to learn about tonight. We were absolutely thrilled when David agreed to loan this rare printing to us. It's one of only 50 known surviving copies, engraved and printed by William Stone, but I'll let David tell you more about the history. And this will be joined next fall by another historic and priceless document, one of the 12 original copies of the Bill of Rights, which we will begin displaying next fall. And in one new gallery, we will have David's Declaration of Independence, our priceless Pennsylvania packet copy of the Constitution, and the Stone Declaration of Independence will be one of the only institutions in America, aside from the National Archives, to be able to display such rare documents. And we are deeply grateful to David's generosity for making this possible. Tonight, David and I are going to talk about the relationship between these documents, between the Declaration of Independence, the US Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, and how one landmark document led to the next in the context of the evolving story of America's battle for freedom. David Rubenstein, it is such a pleasure to introduce him. He is one of the handful of Americans most involved in making possible the kind of display of rare documents, constitutional and civic education, and town hall debate that represent the core of the National Constitution Center's mission. There is a common theme that underlies his loans of historic documents, and that is the evolving story of American freedom. David has been described by the Washington Post as a patriotic philanthropist, and his philanthropy is unambiguously good in the sense that it has educated Americans about the history of freedom, and his love for democracy and freedom runs very deep. You may have read about his recent donation to repair the Washington Monument. My 7-year-old kids were thrilled to attend the reopening ceremony. He's lent a rare 1297 copy of the Magna Carta to the National Archives. He's generously supported Jefferson's Monticello and Washington's Mount Vernon. He is the co-founder and co-chief executive officer of the Carlyle Group. He is a compelling speaker about liberty and democracy. I've had the pleasure of listening to him live several times, and I know how much you'll enjoy hearing him tonight. Please join me in welcoming the patriotic philanthropist, David Rubenstein.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome, David. So glad to have you here. So the obvious first question, patriotic philanthropist, not something that most kids dream of becoming when they grow up. How did you become a patriotic philanthropist, and why did you decide to do this?
Well, first, I didn't dream of it when I was young either. I was just trying to buy baseball cards or do other things that kids do at a young age. So what happened to me was I wanted to be a lawyer, and I wanted to go into government and in politics. And I was inspired when I was in the 6th grade by John Kennedy's famous speech. Some of you obviously have heard of it, the inaugural address, where he said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And so I thought I would like to go into government and help my country. And I thought ultimately probably doing it as a lawyer as I got older and realized what my skill sets were and what they weren't. So I didn't think I had the looks, the charm, the money to get into politics like President Kennedy, but I thought I could be an advisor like Ted Sorensen, who wrote the brilliant inaugural address with President Kennedy. And so I did go to work at that law firm. And after a couple years, it became apparent to me I wasn't that great a lawyer. And nobody seemed to be upset when I said I was going to leave the practice of law. But I got a job in Washington that Ted Sorensen helped me get with Senator Birch Bayh, who he said would be the next President of the United States. It didn't work out for Senator Bayh or me. I then got an interview with a guy who was also running for president, Jimmy Carter. He won. I got to work in the White House. I did that for 4 years, managed to get inflation to 19%, very difficult to do that. And then when we lost the election, I had to go back and practice law again, and I wasn't any better the second time than the first time. So I decided, I read that an entrepreneur, when they start businesses, they typically do it between the ages of 28 and 37. I read that when I was 37. And I said I better do something because I'm not going to be a great lawyer and so forth, and nobody wants me back in government again because of getting inflation so high and so forth. So I started a company, and it took off, and it became very successful. So when I reached the age of 54, I read that on average a white male my age would probably live another 27 years on average, and therefore I realized I'd lived 2/3 of my life, and I only had a third to go on average. Obviously, you can live longer than that. And I realized I'd made a fair amount of money, and I decided I didn't want to die being the richest guy in the cemetery and having my heirs just do whatever they wanted with it, I decided to give away essentially the money while I was alive and spend the remaining third of my life essentially trying to do something good with the money. And among the things I wanted to do was to thank the country for the good fortune that I have, because I came from very modest circumstances. My father worked in the post office, never made more than $7,000 a year, and I figured for me to come to this position that I have now, to have this kind of money, I should thank the country. That's when I began to give away the money, but not only to the country, but to things that meant things to me and my family, but also to the country. I wanted to do things like buy documents so that they could be put on display and people would ultimately think more about the significance of the freedoms that these documents represent, or do other things that help our country, because very often, as we all know, our country cannot afford to do things it did before. So maybe it could figure out how to repair the Washington Monument, but it might have taken longer time, or do other things that it should do. So every philanthropist is really, by definition, patriotic, because you're really, in effect, if you give money to a library, an education, almost anything, you're helping your country. But I kind of said patriotic philanthropy, I guess, is when you're really doing specifically something that benefits something the federal government might otherwise be able to do but can't do because they don't have the money. So the reason I'm doing it is I got lucky, I have the good fortune now, and I want to thank the country for my good fortune by, in part, giving back to the country. That's my theory.
It deserves a round of applause, and here at the Constitution Center, we're honored to be the beneficiary of this beautiful document. So tell us about, first of all, why the Declaration of Independence interests you so much. You've given them to embassies, and you're especially interested in the Declaration, and then tell us about the history of this particular printing of the Declaration.
So everybody's heard of the Declaration of Independence, obviously, and it was drafted in this city, not very far from here. What happened was, for those who may not be experts in it or who may have forgotten their history, when the Second Continental Congress was convened, it was pretty clear that a resolution to separate from England was going to pass, would be voted on and probably pass. So in anticipation of that, it was decided that somebody should draft a reason for it, a declaration you could call it. And so a committee of 5 men was put together, and everybody who was in the Second Continental Congress was a member of a committee, and they typically had responsibility for 22 or 23 committees, so you had an enormous amount of committee responsibilities. One of the committees was to draft this document, and some explanation, assuming that the vote were to occur to separate from England, what would be the reason for it? And they'd want to tell people in the country, they'd want to tell the King of England, they'd want to tell the troops, and inspire them to fight even harder. So a committee was put together of, and how would you like to be on this committee? John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, a very talented man from Connecticut, and Robert Livingston from New York, and then another guy who was very young. He was one of the youngest people at the Second Continental Congress. His name was Thomas Jefferson, 33 years old. He didn't really want to be there because his wife was very ill, and he thought he should attend to his wife. He'd had a number of young children die in recent history. He's had some family illnesses, and he really wanted to be back with his wife, and his wife did die at a very young age, tragically. But so he wasn't sure if he wanted to stay, but they convinced him to stay because the other delegates had gone back from Virginia, and nobody was really there to represent Virginia very much. He was given the assignment to be on this committee. John Adams said to him, you should draft it. You should be the principal draftsman, because as it was reconstructed, Adams said, look, you're from Virginia, I'm from Massachusetts, so people will think I'm too much of a firebrand to want to separate from England. They think I know I will write too fiery a document, I won't have as much credibility. You're from Virginia, and of course Adams wanted to bring along Virginia to the independence movement. You were a person who hasn't made as many enemies as I have. John Adams, I talk all the time in the Continental Congress, and I make a lot of enemies, and people don't like me. And besides, you're a better writer. You write 10 times as well as I do. So like most people who are given an assignment, like all of you, what do? You wait until the end. So Jefferson had 17 days to do this. He was given the assignment at the end of June, but he had the middle of June probably, and he had to produce it by the end of June. He had 17 days, but he had other committee meetings during the day, so he couldn't do it all the time. So with 4 days to go, he decided to sit down and write it. And he wrote it in a rented room not far from here, and he wrote it with no books and no pamphlets beside him. He wrote it more or less from memory. He did have a copy of 2 documents that had come from Virginia, one of which he had written, but he wrote out this document, and the document had 3 parts to it. It had a preamble, which later became the most famous part of it. At the time, it was largely ignored. It had the second part, which is said, here's all the sins of the King of England, and third, here's what we're going to do about it. We're going to separate. So when he drafted this document, he gave it back eventually, after some drafts, back to the committee, and mostly showed it to Adams and to Franklin, and they made some edits on it. They knew that he was a guy that was a brilliant writer, but the guy was very sensitive to criticism. And by the way, although he was a brilliant writer, he hated to talk. So in the entire Continental Congress, he never actually spoke. And as President of the United States, for 2 terms, he only made 1 public speech. That was the first inaugural address. He had a high-pitched voice. He was not that articulate in writing, in speaking, but he loved to write. He wrote 21,000 letters during his lifetime. We have about 14,000 of them. And he had a unique system when to have copies of them, because he would write it out, and then he had another pen attached to it, so would write a copy of it. But when he wrote this document, he gave it to the other members of the committee, and they kind of lightly edited it. They knew they would offend him if they edited too much. Then it was produced back to the Congress on July the 2nd. On July the 2nd, it was voted that we would become independent of England. And John Adams wrote to Abigail Adams saying, this is the most important day in the history of the country, and it will be for 1,000 years, because we're going to celebrate this day every day, July the 2nd, because we voted to be independent. The reason we don't celebrate July the 2nd and celebrate the 4th is this. When a year later, in July of 1777, when the Continental Congress was meeting again, they forgot. They forgot it was July the 2nd 1 year later. So they remembered it on the 3rd. They said, well, geez, we forgot the 2nd, today's the 3rd, let's celebrate the next day, it's the 4th. But actually what happened on July 1776, on the 3rd and the 4th, was on the 3rd, they began the debate of the document that Thomas Jefferson drafted. And he sat there mute. He never responded, he didn't defend it. And about 35% of what he wrote was taken out. He later said it was mutilated. And he was very upset by it. In fact, for 9 years, he refused to admit that he was the principal author of it, because he thought that the draft that had come out of the Congress was worse than his. And in fact, like many, maybe I would have done it, maybe some of you would have done it, he later wrote to his friends and said, by the way, don't you think this Congress did a terrible job? Here's my draft. Here's what they did. Don't you think my draft is better? But at the time, he was so upset that when they made the changes, he didn't really want to admit to it. On the 4th of July, they approved the text as changed. They went next door to a printer. His name was John Dunlop, and said, print 200 copies of this. Now, what was he printing? Well, they'd taken Jefferson's draft, and they had edited it down, so he had the marked up version. Mr. Dunlop printed 200 copies. A copy was sent to George Washington to read to the troops at Valley Forge. A copy was sent to the King of England, each of the states, and so forth. There are only probably about maybe 20 of these left now. The most recent one sold for about $23 million, so they're very valuable. They're called Dunlop broadsides. On July the 4th, when they voted for it, and this document was printed on the 5th, on July the 4th, there was nothing to sign. There was nothing to do, because there was no text. They had edited it. So they got a calligrapher, and they didn't rush him to come out with a document that they could sign. Why was that? Because only 12 states had approved the Declaration of Independence. The New York State was being invaded by the British at the time, so their legislature couldn't consent to approve the resolution to be independent. So New York State didn't approve it. So they said, let's wait for New York State to approve it, and then you all come back when we have the calligrapher has written it out in longhand, and then there's something for you to sign. Now, why would they have to sign it? It wasn't a legal document. There's no reason to sign it. They had sent some other documents to the King of England, and they did sign them, but there's no legal reason, because remember, this is a propaganda document. It just says why we're going to be independent. It doesn't bind anybody. It's not a legal document. There's no legal reason to sign it. They signed it because they wanted to mutually agree to each other that they were bound to support this. And it was courageous because they realized they were committing treason, and that's obviously why John Hancock, made a famous statement about making sure everybody knew that he was signing it and so forth. But they weren't as courageous as it might seem, because they never actually released the signature copy until after Washington won the battles in Trenton and Princeton. After it was pretty clear that the war was going pretty well, then they finally, about 6 months later, actually released the copy with all the signatures. But the copy that they all signed was signed on August the 4th of 1776. So what happened on August the 4th of 1776, they more or less came back, more or less at the same time. They signed it. I think it was 7 people signed it, and they signed it by state. That document was then the legal copy of the Declaration of Independence. And then it became owned by the U.S. government when the U.S. government went into effect. So it was rolled up from time to time. It was taken to New York. It was taken to Philadelphia. When it was in Washington, D.C., and we were invaded by the British, it was rolled up and taken down to Leesburg and hidden. And over the period of time, it kind of was getting a little rough. At one point, later on, in the late 1800s, it was put on display for 30 years in the Patent Office, and it faded. But before that happened, and in recognition that it probably would fade and probably wouldn't be something that people could see. Remember, there was no copies of it, and you didn't have Xeroxing. There was no emails or anything, and no iPads, so how could people see this famous document? John Quincy Adams, when he was Secretary of State, said, we've got to make copies of this document because we need to have copies so everybody can see it, and this is going to fade. So he hired a man you referred to earlier, Mr. William Stone, a printer in Washington, and he said to him, you come up with a process by which we can make perfect copies of this Declaration of Independence before it fades. Over a 3-year period of time, he kind of figured out, how can I do this? And he came up with a process that's still unknown exactly what it is, but the essence of it was he took a wet cloth, sort of, more or less, and put it on the original and took off a perfect copy, taking off half the ink with it. He then took it and put it on a copper plate. 201 copies were then printed. They are called stone copies. One was sent to each of the living survivors, or signers, there are only 3 left, of the Declaration of Independence. One was sent to each state. Certain universities got them. There are probably, I don't know, a limited number of copies left of them. And so when, like you see in the New York Times on the 4th of July, a copy of the Declaration of Independence, you're not seeing the original because that's faded beyond recognition. If you go to the archives where it is, there's nothing, it's so faded you can't even recognize anything. What you're seeing is a stone copy. And that stone copy is a perfect replica of it. And the reason why I think it's significant is that for people to see it, you can see what the document was that they signed. That's exactly what it looks like. And it helps you remind you of that period of time. It doesn't have any significance other than it's a reminder of the significance of it, and I hope it reminds people to think about the freedoms and what led to the Declaration of Independence. So that's the history of it, more than you wanted to know.
It is not more than I wanted to know, and I hereby appoint you a contributing scholar to the National Constitution Center. Right. That was the best account of the history of the Declaration that I've heard. My knowledge, candidly, had been confined to the musical 1776 for the story of why Jefferson didn't want to write it, and thank you for elucidating it so well. All right, so you've loaned us this historic document. You say it was not a legal document, and yet it enumerated or declared the existence of certain natural rights that inhere in all Americans as citizens. I want to discuss with you what you want citizens to know about Jefferson when they have this priceless document. And I love, first of all, you've loaned us the Stone Declaration. I'm going to give you a National Constitution Center Constitution and Declaration. Right. That's a gift. That's the Jeffrey Rosen gift to David Rubenstein.
Thank you very much.
Read the preamble, if you will, and then tell us what you want citizens to know about it. Or maybe you can recite it from memory.
I know the preamble, I hope.
I can't do it from memory.
Now, here's the most important thing to think about it. At the time that it was written, the preamble was insignificant. In the Continental Congress on the 3rd and the 4th, 95% of the time that they spent discussing it was spent discussing the charges against King George. Because the most important thing that they had to do was to say, why are we breaking away? What's the reason? Well, King George must have done something wrong. So Jefferson had, I think, 19 different things that he said that King George had done wrong, and there was one that he emphasized very much. It was that King George had encouraged the slave trade. Now, the truth is, King George didn't encourage the slave trade because the slave trade was encouraged by many other people. That was deleted completely, not because King George didn't encourage it, but it was really because the southern states didn't want to get into slavery. Because if you blame King George for encouraging the slave trade, the implication is that slavery is bad. And the southerners didn't want to say that. So that was eliminated, and that upset Jefferson. There were other things that King George was accused of by Jefferson and that they didn't like. The preamble was an afterthought. So why is it so important now? Let me describe what happened. After the Declaration of Independence was issued, we fought the war. The war wasn't over, the treaty and everything, until 1783. So it's drafted in 1776. The war's not over until 1783. after the deed was done, and people said and saw why we were pulling away from England, and England wrote its own response to this, saying this is really ridiculous. King George didn't do any of these things, truthfully. But the British also heavily criticized the preamble. The preamble wasn't something that was that significant to Jefferson. I'll tell you why in a moment. But in later years, the preamble became the most important part of it. And the reason is that it is said to have captured perfectly the essence of what our country was about, even though it was ironic that Jefferson wrote something that seems so much not true, but a lie. He said, in a sentence that's now regarded by many as the most famous sentence in the English language, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." Now, actually, he wrote, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." And Benjamin Franklin, being a good editor, said, well, let's just shorten it. Let's make it self-evident. So Jefferson said, okay. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness." Okay, so he says in there something that all men are created equal. How can he do that when he owned 60 slaves at a time? He had 2 slaves with him. How can he say all men are created equal? In Jefferson's view, people were created equal, but they couldn't live together as equals. That was a distinction. You could say it's ridiculous, but that's how he came up with that idea. But the idea that all men are created equal later was taken on by the French Revolution and by other people who wanted certain rights. In Seneca Falls, when that convention occurred, women were citing the Declaration of Independence. In subsequent revolutions around the world, people say, well, Jefferson's words really symbolize what we want. All men are created equal. We have certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. When we had the civil rights debates in the United States in the early 60s and so forth, Martin Luther King and others kept saying in his famous address in Lincoln Memorial, we have to honor the promise that Jefferson wrote, all men are created equal. Now, the truth is, it was empty rhetoric, because Jefferson knew that all men weren't really going to be equal, and really what he was talking about wasn't all men and all people, it was really all white men. That's really what he meant. Now, Jefferson wasn't a big supporter of slavery. Early on, he opposed it in Virginia, but he realized he wasn't going to get anywhere politically by opposing it, so he kind of dropped his opposition to slavery, and he lived with slaves the rest of his life, and as we know, most people would say he had an affair with a slave for 30 plus years, fathered 6 children with her, most people would say, some dispute that, and he didn't free his slaves, or many of his slaves, when he died, so he lived through slavery, so he still said all men are created equal. But it's that inspiration of the idea of all men are created equal is something that has taken on a life of its own, and now it is said to be the most perfect embodiment of what this country is about. All men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, including among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that is said to be, let's say, the best statement of what country is all about. When Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln always believed that Jefferson was the greatest American, and he believed that when Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he was in effect saying, yes, there is something that is unique about this country, and that's what Lincoln wrote about in his famous Gettysburg Address. And he, in effect, took Jefferson's language and put it into his Gettysburg Address. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And now 77 years ago refers to 1776, so he wasn't referring to the Constitution, referring to what Jefferson had written. And it's the idea that all men are created equal is really kind of the embodiment of what many people would say this country's about. What Jefferson probably should have written is all men should be created equal. But he didn't really say that, or all men should have equal opportunity, or all men and women should have equal opportunity. But when he wrote all this, actually he wasn't doing it by himself. He was really doing what later people would call plagiarism. Remember, Jefferson didn't have any books that he was copying from, but he did have some documents that more or less said the same thing. This language, that all men are created equal and have certain unalienable rights, really came from something that was written in Virginia by George Mason. And George Mason really more or less wrote the same thing. Jefferson kind of took it, and those days it was considered a sign of great scholarly learning and a very good thing to take what other people had written and kind of improve upon it a bit. You didn't have to cite them. You didn't have to give footnotes. Plagiarism wasn't a word that really existed. And so Jefferson more or less plagiarized what George Mason said. He said it somewhat more eloquently, and that's what it is. So the reason it's so important is that the document has become the symbol of what this country is all about. But it was forgotten from, let's say, the time of the Revolutionary War until probably around 1815. People ignored the Declaration of Penance. It was only when we were beginning to fight with Britain again, and we were beginning to look for things that reminded us of our history, that people went back to the Declaration of Penance. In the first couple of years after the Declaration of Penance was drafted, people said, okay, that was why we broke away, but they kind of had more things to worry about. They had to win the Revolutionary War. They had to get a government in place. They had to make the government work. They weren't worried about the Declaration of Penance. It's in later years, really in the 20th century, maybe more than the 19th century, that people came back to read over and over again what Jefferson wrote, and it's so eloquent and so well stated that people have taken it to mean a symbol of our country, and that's why it's become so important.
All right, that is beautifully said, and that gives a powerful account of how Lincoln and the Civil War perfected Jefferson's vision of equality. But we have another job tonight, and also in creating this new gallery, which is to tell the relationship between the Declaration, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Tell us, isn't it the idea of unalienable rights, rights that come from God and not government, and that you can surrender to government for safekeeping but can't actually give up the rights themselves? Is that the connection between the Declaration and the Bill of Rights?
The idea that you have certain unalienable rights, and all of you probably realize that the word is inalienable, not unalienable.
Now, the natural rights theorists, I got this from law school,
right.
So they use the two terms interchangeably, and we have Jefferson's library
right.
in the permanent exhibit. Francis Hutcheson, John Locke, Burlamaqui, they often used unalienable and inalienable interchangeably. Was there a difference between
Jefferson wrote inalienable. The calligrapher misread his writing, actually, what happened, but okay.
Huh.
So anyway, what happened was at those times, a number of European philosophers and writers, John Locke, Montesquieu, and others, had written about the fact that people have certain unalienable rights that come from God or come from just virtue of being a human being. And Jefferson was reflecting that, and George Mason had reflected that when he had written the Virginia Declaration of Human Rights, from which Jefferson took a lot of this language. So it was common in those days in Europe to think this, and in the United States as well. And the English Declaration of Rights had more or less said the same thing, and it was earlier. So the idea that you have certain rights is something that people thought that you had, and really the Declaration of Independence came about, and the whole Revolutionary War came about because people in this country in those days thought that they had the same rights that Englishmen had. In fact, the charters that were given to each of the colonies said that you have the rights of Englishmen. The rights of Englishmen are the rights of the Magna Carta, the rights of the English Declaration of Human Rights, but in the end, when the Parliament and King George said, well, we're not honoring those rights, you're different, you really don't have the same rights, despite what those charters would say, you have the rights that we give you because you are owned by us. That's what really led to the revolution, because the rights that people thought they had in this country, against right to trial by jury, right to proportionate crime for punishment for a crime, a right to habeas corpus, those rights were being denied by the British. And so it was the feeling that you had certain rights that you weren't getting. Okay, so Jefferson writes this, says we have certain rights. When the Constitution is being drafted, why wouldn't you put in the Constitution that we have these rights? Well, as you all probably know, the famous Constitutional Convention held here in 1787 in the same room that the Declaration of Independence was drafted, the same group, a different group of people came together, and Jefferson wasn't in that at the time. He was, in effect, ambassador to France. After 4 months, they came up with the Constitution. And it was debated in the last 5 days. George Mason spoke up and said, we should have some rights put in this Constitution because all we're doing is coming up with a structure of government. We don't really say what our rights are. And Elbridge Gerry agreed to the same thing, famous later because of gerrymandering. And one other delegate also spoke up for it. But it was voted down. You voted by state delegation, and unanimously it was voted, each state delegation voted against having a Bill of Rights or certain rights attached. Now, why was that? And why would James Madison, the man who actually later wrote the Bill of Rights when he was a member of Congress, the first Congress, why did he oppose it? Because it was generally viewed at the time that if you have a specific rights enumerated in the Constitution, that in effect means that all the rights that are not enumerated you don't have. And they didn't want to actually exclude any rights. Secondly, many of the people said, wait a second, the states have given us rights. We have the rights to our states. We're really citizens of our states, and we have certain rights in our constitutions, and as we're now drafting our state constitutions, we're putting them in there. Why do we need to have it in the federal Constitution? And some members said, wait a second, if you start talking about rights, everybody gets around to this everybody's treated equal kind of thing, and we don't want that because that's going to deal with slavery. And we don't want to really fool around with the idea that everybody's equal, because every time you have descriptions of rights, inevitably it gets to that everybody's equal, and a lot of the Southern delegates to the Constitutional Convention didn't want to do it. So the vote was not to have a Bill of Rights in it. They ratified the Constitution is approved. It's then sent back to the Congress. The Congress was actually the Articles of Confederation Congress. So this Constitutional Convention, which was designed to just amend the Articles of Confederation, they actually came up with a whole new government. It was sent to the Articles of Confederation Congress without saying they approved it or disapproved it. They just said, we'll send it out to each of the states. Each of the states called a convention to ratify it. In the ratification process, which took about 2 years, many of the states said, we don't really trust government. We don't trust the federal government so much. We don't know what it's all about. Let's have some rights. Let's have some rights specified. So in order to get it ratified, many of the people who were promoting it, like Madison and Hamilton and so forth, kind of agreed that they would have a Bill of Rights in the first Congress. And so sure enough, in the first Congress, James Madison wrote out, and with the help of others, 12 amendments to the Constitution that were approved, and the Congress approved the 12 amendments, but then it went to the states for ratification. Only 10 of them were approved, and those 10 became the Bill of Rights. But the initial argument was that Madison made, then he later reversed himself, was that we don't need them because the rights are either implied or we don't want to enumerate them because we will lose certain rights that maybe aren't enumerated, and also the states already have these rights. But in the end, Madison changed his view and said, let's be specific, and he wrote out these rights, and now that became an important part of the Constitution. However, for the first 100 years, it was more or less ignored. In other words, as you know, the Supreme Court didn't repeatedly say, well, let's look to the 14th or to the Bill of Rights for certain rights. They kind of ignored it for a large part of the constitutional, or the first 100 years after it was drafted and approved, because it just wasn't seen to be as significant as other things that gave certain rights, including the state constitutions.
Absolutely, and as you say, because the Bill of Rights wasn't applied against the states until the late 20th century, it wasn't as significant as it is today. So you identified two concerns. First, that the Bill of Rights was initially unnecessary, and second, it would be dangerous, because if you wrote it down, you might think if it wasn't written down, it wasn't covered.
Correct.
The Ninth Amendment is designed to avoid that misconstruction. It says the enumeration of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people.
That's right.
What should is the Ninth Amendment the tie between the Declaration and the Bill of Rights?
Well, Madison wrote that because that was designed to counter that argument that he previously had. He previously had argued the other side of that case. He previously said, that we can't be specific on everything because we'll forget certain things or so forth. So they did put that amendment in, but I'd say that the relation between the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, I guess, is this, that in the Declaration, people were told they had certain rights, unalienable rights, but to be honest, the Declaration wasn't that important a document when they were drafting the Constitution. The preamble wasn't as important. It later became more important later after the Bill of Rights was agreed to. But people were not in the Constitutional Convention talking about the Declaration of Independence. They really weren't. They were really talking about the state constitutions and what the state constitutions already had or were going to have, and they just didn't really talk about it. Now, the relation now is today, I think, when people think about what rights we have, people think about the Declaration of Independence and talking about the rights we have, but the Declaration of Independence was a propaganda document. It didn't give any rights to anybody. It just was an advertisement about why we were breaking away from England.
But as you've described it, it was more than that, in this sense, that it was declaring the existence of these natural rights that everyone knew existed. They were in the state constitutions, they're written in the Declaration, and they ended up in the Bill of Rights. And it was a limited set. And the most important was the right to alter and abolish government when it becomes destructive of purposes. So that was what Jefferson declares, and that's embodied in Article 5 of the Constitution, which allows for amendment.
It's a very interesting thing Jefferson is in effect saying in the Declaration of Penance, when in the course of human events, so forth, as he begins the beginning, becomes necessary for one people to break the political binds they have with other people, he's in effect saying there is a right to revolution if your rights are not being honored. And then in the Constitution, though, it doesn't say that in the effect, it doesn't say that if these rights aren't being honored, you have the right to overturn this government. It doesn't say that. Now, you could argue that the people who seceded from the Union in the Civil War, they would say, well, look, we're just doing what Jefferson said we should do. If we're not getting certain rights we think we should get, let's break away. But the Constitution didn't permit that.
Well, in fact, at the end of his life, Jefferson was endorsing the states' rights arguments that would ultimately be embraced by the secessionists and Calhoun, whereas John Marshall, Jefferson's arch nemesis, denied the right to secede because, like Lincoln, he insisted that it was the people of the United States who were sovereign, not the people of each state. And James Wilson, who's in Saunders Hall, was the identifier of that shift. Is that a debate? Is that a story we have to tell? It wasn't decided until the Civil War. Who is sovereign, the people of the United States or the individual states?
Who is granting these rights? Do they come from God? Did they come from the people? Well, there was an argument that people believed in the colonial days that the rights that you need to have were certain inalienable rights, more or less came from, let's say, God, though Jefferson didn't like to say that. And in fact, the word God was put into the Declaration of Independence by the editors more than by him, the people at the convention, because he wasn't a gigantic believer in God, let's say, in the traditional sense that we now think about it. He was a deist. He believed there was some super being, but not one who was really involved in day-to-day life, let's say. And as you may know, when he was considered so anti-religious that when he offered to sell his library to the Library of Congress, the Library of Congress's books were burned in the War of 1812, many members of Congress didn't want to buy his books because they thought he had a lot of anti-religious, anti-God books, and they wanted to go through every single one of his books to make sure they were appropriate. But anyway, in those days, you had to say, where were the rights coming from? And I think most people believed that the rights were coming from God, more or less, inalienable rights, but that what you had to protect against was an executive. In other words, what they were trying to do was to protect people from certain government action. So protect against what King George did. They wanted to make sure that the legislature in the future, the Congress, wouldn't take away their rights. Interestingly, the rights that people focused on in the Bill of Rights were really rights that were designed to give people protections against government action that would be taking away liberties. Later, the Bill of Rights became more a document that defended people not so much when government was overall doing the people, but defending the rights of minorities and people who didn't have the protections of the majority. And that's really what the Bill of Rights has become more of in recent years. It protects people that don't have, the wealth or the great power, and it gives them certain protections. It's not so much that government is taking away all the powers of all the people that was the initial concern of the Bill of Rights. It was the concern of the people who wanted the Bill of Rights that government would be too powerful and government would come along and in an arbitrary way take away certain rights. Today we don't worry about government taking away all of our rights, but certain people in the country feel that, let's say, that their rights might be taken away, and they often tend to be people who are the least enfranchised in the society.
So whether you care more about government abuse or about equality, of course, depends on whether you stop with the original Bill of Rights or go on to the 14th Amendment. What do you think about Marshall versus Jefferson? They had terrible insults for each other. They were distant relations. Marshall called Jefferson, he accused him of twistifications, Marshall called Jefferson the great llama of the mountain. That was his insult, and I never understood exactly what that meant. Jefferson accused Marshall of twistifications, but it's arguable that Marshall had a greater influence on the Constitution. He had this vision of a united sovereign people and of judicial review, the power of the courts to strike down unconstitutional laws. Jefferson, at the end of his life, is questioning both of those propositions, endorsing states' rights, questioning the power of judicial review. Who is more influential, Marshall or Jefferson?
Well, Jefferson and more influential in our country's history, I would say Jefferson, because of what he stands for, the Declaration of Penance. Interestingly, while Jefferson, for 9 years, didn't want to admit that he drafted the Declaration of Penance because he didn't like the way it was, quote, mutilated, as he got towards the end of his life, he began to prepare what he wanted on his tombstone, and he wanted to have the first thing being the author of the Declaration of Penance, not the draftsman, the author. And that's an interesting point. When he was appointed to draft the Declaration of Independence, he wasn't supposed to be the author, he was supposed to be the draftsman, and so he probably took too much pride in his penmanship. You know, these kind of subcommittees and committees that were operating, you weren't supposed to be the author of something like a novel. You were supposed to be providing ideas for people to mark up. But anyway, he later regarded himself as the author of it, and that was what he regarded as his greatest achievement. And in terms of influence, I think he was one of the most influential people in the way our country's evolved. On the other hand, a very famous historian, Pauline Maier, wrote a book about the Declaration of Penance, and later, and previously she had said the most overrated American by far was Thomas Jefferson. And she defended that till she died in view that he was given way too much credit for Declaration of Penance, because her view was that many people had their role in it. Jefferson was an interesting person in the sense that he lived this double life. He fathered 6 children with Sally Hemings, and interestingly, this is a digression, and there are some people who dispute it, but I believe the DNA evidence is pretty compelling, but there are books written that have a different point of view. But one book which won the Pulitzer Prize, The Hemings of Monticello, by Annette Gordon-Reed, I think makes it pretty clear that Jefferson did father these children. But interestingly, and some people often wonder about this and try to deny it, you might say, why did Jefferson do this? Well, it wasn't that uncommon to have slavery, to have sexual relations between slave owners and slaves. That wasn't uncommon. But think about this interesting fact. When Jefferson's wife died, Jefferson was 39. On her deathbed, she said, I had a stepmother. We have 2 daughters now. Some children had died. We have 2 daughters. I don't want them to have a stepmother. Promise me you'll never get married again. So what is he supposed to say? Okay, I'm 39 years old. I'll never get married again. He wanted to please his wife, who he was deeply in love with. He said he wouldn't get married again, and he never did. But when he was when he was in France, he asked to have one of his daughters brought over. One of his daughters already there. A daughter that was brought over by a slave in the residence, and the slave was 14 years old. That was Sally Hemings. And he must, I don't know if he saw her before or not, but he may have recognized her because Sally Hemings' father was the same father as Thomas Jefferson's wife. In other words, Thomas Jefferson's father-in-law was the person that his daughter was the person that Thomas Jefferson married. As a slave owner, he impregnated a slave, and the result of that was Sally Hemings. So Sally Hemings was really the stepsister of Thomas Jefferson's wife, and bore no doubt, a striking relationship to her because she was probably 3/4 white and probably looked very much like Thomas Jefferson's wife. And an interesting relationship. But anyway, Thomas Jefferson led this double life. He was a complicated person, brilliant. He lived, and as many of you all may know, he died on July the 4th, 1823, exactly the same day as John Adams. And that was taken as an incredible symbol by people in the country. The 2 principal people who were involved with the Declaration of Independence and the Declaration to separate from England, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, died on the same day. It was taken as a kind of a sign from God that there was something special about the Declaration of Independence. But Jefferson had his feuds. He was Secretary of State the first Secretary of State under George Washington. And he didn't like George Washington. He couldn't get along with Alexander Hamilton, so eventually he quit. He started bad-mouthing George Washington, saying George Washington wasn't that smart and so forth, and Washington heard about it, never talked to him again. Jefferson had many enemies, and John Marshall was one of them. John Marshall, what he did as a lawyer, as a Chief Justice, obviously had enormous impact. Jefferson didn't have that much impact on the law, but as an overall citizen, he probably had more impact.
On the Constitution, though, Jefferson was away during the convention. I ask because I need substantively to figure this out. Who had more influence on the Constitution, Jefferson or Marshall, and whose vision is embodied today? Who won that battle of states' rights versus national power?
Well, in the end, Marshall, because of Marbury v. Madison and other things, and he also was Chief Justice for a long time, very long time, so he had a lot of impact. But there's no doubt to me, the man who had the most impact on the Constitution was James Madison. Now, Madison, remember, everybody in the Constitutional Convention was not supposed to talk about it on the outside, and they sealed the windows. It was very hot, so sometimes they would go to the second floor where the windows could be open. But there were very few leaks, but Madison kept a meticulous diary, and it was eventually published after his death, and it was the most meticulous and best accounting of what happened. Since he wrote it, obviously he probably featured himself, but he was a person who kind of put the Constitutional Convention together. He drafted the Bill of Rights with the help of others. He was very influential, and so I think he, probably more than anybody else, is responsible for the Constitution that we know today, but the person most responsible for the way the Constitution is interpreted probably is Marshall, because of what he did with the way the court interprets the Constitution.
When I came in this morning, one of our great colleagues wanted me to ask this question: should the Constitution today be interpreted in light of the Declaration of Independence?
Well, the Declaration of Independence, remember, again, it wasn't a legal document. It was designed for one purpose: to explain to people why we are going to be independent, or need to be independent of England. But the rights that were talked about there are ones that I think really have been infused into the Declaration of Independence, into the Constitution now, and the way we interpret it. So, yes, today, whatever is talked about in the Declaration of Independence is really in effect in the Constitution the way it's now been interpreted over many, many years. But the document should be read as different kinds of documents with different purposes. One was to set up a government, one was to kind of justify breaking away from another government, and so they're different. One is creating a government, one is, in effect, getting ready to break away from another government. But I think they are, in the Americans' minds, they're fused together in many ways, because they represent what's the best thing about this country. They, in effect, are symbols of the freedoms that I was talking about at the beginning. The freedoms that enabled me to do what I did, and the freedoms that enable people here and many people in our country to achieve what they've done, are freedoms that were kind of alluded to in the Declaration of Independence, guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, and then ultimately approved and sanctioned by the Supreme Court in many ways.
That's good. I want to say it again, because I want to make sure I have two sentences to put at the entrance to the gallery about the relationship. What is the relationship between
the Declaration of
and
Independence made certain promises about what certain rights would exist, but they weren't really legal rights until they were put in the legal documents of the Bill of Rights, and to some extent the Constitution. The Constitution, before the Bill of Rights, actually it has some rights in it itself. The Bill of Rights expands on it, but there are certain rights in the core of the Constitution itself. But still, I think the Constitution is a legal document that was influenced by the concepts that you have certain rights. It wasn't only the Declaration of Independence that made people think in those days you had certain rights. There were other writings. Remember, each of the state constitutions had their own Bill of Rights.
That leads to the first of the audience questions, which is excellent. What's the relationship, if any, of the Bill of Rights to any of the original state constitutions? Can you be more specific? Many of those constitutions enumerated the same natural rights that were in the Declaration and Bill of Rights. What's the relationship?
You know, the Declaration of Independence, the one that's here is a very famous one. Okay, but many states issued their own Declaration of Independence before this one was issued. In other words, states and cities, very frequently, there are literally hundreds of declarations of independence that were drafted by cities, counties, municipalities, and states that were drafted either before this one or subsequent to this one, that kind of said, hey, we don't know about the federal government, let us tell you, we the people of this city of Massachusetts, we have our own Declaration of Independence. So many of those alluded to the same rights that Jefferson did. Secondly, when the state constitutions were being drafted, and why were they being drafted? Every state, in effect, had a charter from England. Well, when we dissolved our binds with England, we're no longer part of them. Those charters are no longer valid. So every state had to have its own constitution. As they were being drafted, they were drafted to include, in many cases, the certain rights, including their Bill of Rights and what we now call the Bill of Rights. So many of the Bill of Rights that we now have is in our federal Constitution were in other constitutions, and some of it may have been well copied from the Virginia Bill of Rights, for example.
Another excellent question. Do you think any of the three branches of government has overstepped the original intent of the written Constitution? In other words, what would James Madison have thought of the government shutdown?
Well,
that was my addition, but I think that's what the question is asking.
I would think he would say, this wasn't what I intended, and I wish it hadn't happened. I hope that's what he would have said, because that's what I would say if I were in his situation. Obviously, that wasn't what the founders intended. But I think, to be honest, remember, the first article of the Constitution, is it the executive or the legislative branch? It's the legislative branch. Because in those days, it was considered that the people who had the power were legislators, parliaments. The concept of an executive was relatively novel. And remember, we didn't even have a real executive of any consequence under the Articles of Confederation. So it was thought in those days you could have a government without an executive. And therefore, they did when the Articles of Confederation. We really didn't have an executive. It was then later thought that maybe an executive would work, and if George Washington hadn't existed, maybe they wouldn't have designed the second article that way, because it was known at the time that he was likely to be the president, and it was kind of designed in the Constitutional Convention to do something that would be appropriate for him. In other words, why would you say the president, the chief executive, would be the commander-in-chief? Normally, you wouldn't say the commander-in-chief of the Army would be the same person who's the executive of the government. But because it was known that Washington was qualified to do that, and it's probably written that way, and Washington never disagreed with that. Obviously, he never spoke up against doing that. So I think if Madison came back or Washington came back, what they would say that they did not anticipate was that the executive became so powerful, and many people would say more powerful than the Congress, and I don't think they would have anticipated that the judiciary became as important. But it's important to note that in the third article, the article that deals with the judiciary, that was very novel. It was a very novel idea that there should be an independent branch called the judiciary, because generally in those days, courts weren't really that independent. Courts were often thought to do exactly what the executives wanted, what the legislators wanted. The idea of an independent judiciary was a very novel concept, and I doubt that even the founders would have thought, if they came back today, that the judiciary should be as powerful as it later became.
Hamilton, of course, thought the judiciary would be the least dangerous branch because it had neither purse nor sword. Have the courts become too powerful and does that violate the intent of the framers?
Well, you'd have to ask Justice Scalia about that, but
I will. I've invited him to the Constitution Center, and I promise to ask him as soon as he comes.
Obviously, I think the founders would be shocked if they came back today. If the figures in the other room were to come back from wherever they are and here, they would no doubt say, well, we thought the legislature would be the most important, executive maybe second, and then the judiciary, well, that was nice too, but we didn't think they would be really an equal branch. So I think they would be surprised. Has it become too powerful? That's a decision beyond something I can really comment on, but there's no doubt that the fact that the judiciary has become as powerful as it has become is something that nobody probably could have anticipated, because the judiciary was given very little authority in the times.
Speaking of Justice Scalia, here's a good question. What's your opinion of the 10th Amendment? Do you believe, like Judge Bork, that it's superfluous? I think the questioner means the Ninth Amendment. Judge Bork did believe well, Judge Bork thought the Ninth Amendment was superfluous, but the 10th Amendment is the question.
Amendment
so what do you
reserves
think
all the states.
All powers not granted to the states are reserved to the states or to the people, respectively. The Tea Party cares a lot about it. Some claim that the federal government has become too strong. Yes. The Supreme Court is invoking it. What do you think?
Well, I'm not a constitutional law scholar like you, so I wouldn't know exactly how to interpret. I would say at the time, in order to get the Bill of Rights approved through the process, that 10th Amendment was put in order to make it clear that while we're enumerating all these rights, we're not, in fact, taking over all the powers that the states have. And so don't worry that these rights are going to be the ones that you now have. You have no other rights, and any rights that not described here, the federal government doesn't grant to you, and you can't get them from the states. So they were kind of protecting themselves a bit for people who didn't, some people didn't really want the Bill of Rights, and some people, remember, not all state legislatures wanted it. Some people actually liked the idea of not having a Bill of Rights because of the equality arguments and other things like that. But some of those who wanted it, even though they wanted to make it clear that the states were still the most important entity in the system. And in those days, the state governments were more important than the federal government, and they didn't want to have the federal government taking away rights that the state governments really thought they had.
Well, you've identified this tension, which we probably do have to describe in talking about the relation between the documents. On the one hand, the framers wanted to empower government because the Articles of Confederation were too weak. On the other hand, they wanted to limit government to protect individuals. How would you describe that, the way they struck that balance?
Well, look, they spent 4 months. You had about 57 delegates, I think it was. Ultimately, 39 people, I think, signed the Declaration of Independence. 3 who were there at the end refused to sign it because it didn't have a Bill of Rights. Think about this. If today you were to take 35 or take 57 Americans, who would be the 57 Americans you would trust to come up with a new Constitution? Let's pretend we need a new Constitution. You're going to get 57 Americans who are going to, let's say, be more representative than the 57 who were there. So you've got a representative 57 Americans. Does anybody think that these 57 Americans would come up with a better experiment and a better government than these guys came up with? Probably most people would say no. Everybody would like to be in that Constitutional Convention. Everybody would like to say, here's what the government should do. But it was an experiment, and they were, I won't say it was quite a riverboat gamble, but it was an experiment to kind of create a new government out of whole cloth. Remember, there had never been a government created out of whole cloth. All governments before came from rulers who were kings or the equivalents of kings. There had never been a wholly created republican government. It had never happened before. So it was an incredible experiment, and one that obviously worked. And think about it now, the Constitution, while in the span of history is relatively young, a couple hundred years, it's the oldest Constitution still surviving in the world. Many people have drafted them since then, and many of them have fallen apart because they weren't taken as seriously by people, and therefore nobody has a Constitution today that's older than the one we have, and ours is probably less likely to be thrown away than any other one that I know of, because I think people think it works reasonably well. But think about how unlikely it was that 57 white men, all relatively privileged and relatively wealthy and relatively well educated, could come up with a government in 4 months that ultimately has survived for 200 plus years. It's an amazing thing when you think about it.
You give the Declaration to foreign embassies. What do you want people who are writing constitutions abroad to know about the Declaration and the Constitution?
Well, what you're referring to is this. I had a replica of the stone copy made. There are only a limited number, so you can't have an original of the stone, but a replica made with a historic frame, and I provided it to every American embassy. So when you walk into an American embassy overseas now, you will see somewhere in the beginning of the embassy a copy of the Declaration, and the theory that it's a symbol of our country. It represents certain, important rights, and it's what I think some of the best things about our country. I think, it wouldn't be a bad idea to have the Bill of Rights displayed as well. Maybe that's another project, but
so done if you want to make that possible.
I do think that when people think of our country, they think about the rights that we have that are so incredibly powerful and so an important part of our country. It is amazing the Constitution was actually put together without the rights being specifically described at the initial Constitution. And it is amazing how the Declaration, while it is more or less an advertisement, a propaganda document, a not legal document, has come to symbolize certain rights that we have, even though it doesn't legally provide any rights.
One questioner asks, what were the 2 rights that weren't ratified by the states in the original Bill of Rights? And we have them here, and they'll be in the document we'll display next year. The first deals with representation in Congress, and the second became the 27th Amendment about varying the compensation for senators.
Right.
How important is it to see the original documents that show the rights that weren't enumerated?
Well, what is the purpose? People ask me all the time, why do you bother buying these documents and putting them on display? What's the big deal about it? Because we all know what the text is. We can read it in here. Why not just carry this around? Why bother fooling around with this? Well, my theory is that despite the age of digitization and the age when you can sit in your home and look at everything, there is a value to actually going out and touching and feeling something. So we can look at pictures of animals, but why do we have a zoo? Well, because when you actually see them in person, you get a different experience. So when you stand in front of a document that, in some cases, let's say the original document of the Constitution or the original Declaration of Penance, and you sit there and realize that people who are very famous founding fathers actually put their signature on that document you're watching, it does make you think, well, wow, what were they thinking about? Why did they do that? And it makes you want to learn more about history. So what I'm trying to do by having these documents displayed in places and not put them in my home is to have school children, young adults particularly, think about the history of our country, realize how amazing it is, and that the rights that we have are unique in the world, and that learn more about the history. How did we get these rights? What did the Constitution really guarantee? How did it come about? How did the Declaration come about? If we can learn a little bit more about history, I think we'll have better citizens and be a better country. So it's really designed to get people to think about things. Nobody's life is necessarily going to change by seeing the original of this as opposed to a photocopy. But I do think when you see something that's original, you tend to have a different experience. You think about it more. Children are more excited about it. Young adults are more excited about it. And hopefully even older adults are excited about it. So that's the reason for it. It's not that it's going to all of a sudden change the world by having the original versus what's in here. But I think when you read this, as nice as this is, you don't have the same kind of experience as going up there and seeing it and thinking, wow, that guy wrote his signature that way, and maybe I would have written it a different way.
You have this mission that school kids and adults and Americans and everyone should care about history and be engaged by it. That's one of our missions of civic education. If we can't get people to see the physical document, how should we take the Constitution to the schools? What message would you bring and what medium would you bring it in?
Well, Justice O'Connor, after she retired from the Supreme Court, among other things, she started a program to kind of get people to learn more about civics, because her theory, which I agree with, is that people don't know as much about our government as they should, and informed citizenry is the most important thing we can do in terms of making sure our government works well. And so I do think we should have more education of history, and let me describe this. Everybody has heard of STEM, I assume more or less. STEM means science, technology, engineering, math. And the theory is that our school children today don't have enough STEM education, and therefore we're falling behind certain other countries because we're not educating enough engineers and so forth. No doubt there's a lot of that to that as well. But recently, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences had a commission study whether we should do more in humanities and teach more about the humanities and the liberal arts. And that commission, chaired by, among others, co-chaired by Dick Broadhead, who was the president of Duke University, did a wonderful job of explaining why it is that an informed citizenry needs to know more than just STEM-related things. You need to have a liberal arts background, and many people I know in the business community did not actually get a STEM background, and they didn't get educated in business. They got educated in the liberal arts, English or history or things like that, and because those disciplines teach you to think a lot, and you can actually learn the business part later on in life. So I try to say to students, look, don't worry about what your career is going to be 10 or 15 or 20 years down the road. Make sure you learn how to reason, how to think. And one of the best ways to do that is learning the liberal arts, the humanities, and one of the most important parts is history. George Santayana, the famous Harvard historian, said those who forget history are condemned to relive it. So if you don't remember your history and don't know your history, you're likely to make, and citizens were likely to make the same mistakes we've made before. So that's why I think it's important for Americans not only to learn their history, and important for all people to learn their history, but in our country, because we have such a unique set of rights, and we have such a unique set of privileges, I do think it's important for people to learn how they came about and why we should do everything we can to protect them.
What age can you start at? My kids are 7, and we have little constitutional debates around the dinner table.
I assume you win those? Or?
No, I moderate. We're nonpartisan here at the National Constitution Center. Should civics start in, they're in second grade. Should civics start that early?
Obviously you can't learn at the second grade too many details, but I think beginning in the elementary school, letting people know more about history. When I was in high school, we always, maybe you had the same experience, you get to the middle of the textbook, and then the school year was over, so you didn't actually get to past the certain years, and you didn't actually learn the history. But I think we don't really teach our American history very well, and you can graduate from almost any college in the United States today, probably every college in the United States, without taking a course in American history. So think about it. We have this unique history, we have this unique country, yet you can graduate from any great college and never take a course in American history.
Back to Madison. An audience member asks, why wasn't Madison involved in the writing and drafting of the Declaration? And if Jefferson was a representative of Virginia, why didn't they collaborate? What happened to Madison when it came to the Declaration?
Well, Madison, at the time, was not a delegate to that convention. In other words, he was very young, and he would probably been too young to have been. In other words, he would have probably been in his early 20s, I think, at the time. So I think the earliest person who was part of the Second Continental Congress was probably in 26 or 27. I think Madison was even younger than that. So he wouldn't have probably been senior enough to been invited to be to that Continental Congress.
Is it true that people didn't start reading the Declaration widely until Lincoln started quoting it shortly before and during the Civil War?
Didn't read the Declaration, you're saying?
Yeah.
Well, it didn't become a holy document. Some call it American scripture until much later. And the same was true of like the Gettysburg Address. People forget this. It was, of course, everybody knows it was a 2-minute address. The great speaker in that day was Edward Everett, who spoke for 2 hours. He was the most important speaker. Lincoln speaks for 2 minutes. The Gettysburg Address didn't become famous for maybe 50 years after Gettysburg. It was only later, when the Lincoln Memorial was opened in 1922, they put the words on the Lincoln Memorial. and later people began to see it as a perfect embodiment of what our country's all about, that people began to play it over and over again. It was during World War I and World War II, but Gettysburg Address was forgotten for many years after Lincoln gave it. The same was true with the Declaration of Penance in many ways. I think, Lincoln helped revive the idea that it was very important. And Gary Wills, who wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book on the Gettysburg Address, said that what Lincoln did was one of the greatest sleight of hands of all time, because the Civil War was really about keeping the Union together. But in that sentence that I just quoted 77 years ago, what Lincoln is saying, in effect, we're fighting this war because we want to make sure all men are created equal. After he gave that speech, a lot of Northern soldiers said, wait a second, I'm not fighting to make sure everybody's equal, I'm fighting to keep the Union together. What do you mean, we're going to free the slaves? I'm not in favor of that. And so the sleight of hand was that, in effect, what Lincoln did is he kind of redefined what the war was about. It had always been about holding the Union together, but with that speech, he kind of said it's really about showing that everybody's equal. In effect, we're going to eliminate slavery. And that was, and when Lincoln was inspired to do that by the idea that Jefferson had written in the Declaration of Penance, that all men are created equal, that always stayed in Lincoln's mind. Lincoln was not a great abolitionist. He'd never been that, and he always had said, look, I'll do whatever I can to keep the Union together, and if slavery staying together, it keeps the Union together, I'll do that. But it was later that he kind of realized that slavery just couldn't work, and ultimately that he kind of fell back on Jefferson's words and it just kind of bore into his mind that that's what the country was all about. And so he kind of helped revive the Declaration of Penance by his speech at Gettysburg.
Great. This is the last question, and it kind of sums up our conversation. It's a great one. What is a right?
Well, it's something you want, and you think will enable you to do something that you should have the ability to do, but without it, you may not have the ability to do it. And obviously, rights are interpreted different ways, but the freedoms that we have in the Bill of Rights and the freedoms that most Americans have to do pretty much what they want is something that is so unique. And as I go around the world and I travel a lot, I'm amazed at how many other countries want the kind of freedoms that we have, but often they don't have them. And that's what makes our country so unique. The freedoms often guaranteed by the Bill of Rights and by the courts, but also maybe they came back from the initial language in the Declaration of Penance. Again, while it wasn't a legal document, it did ultimately become to be seen as the perfect embodiment of what this country is all about. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That kind of embodies what this country is about, and probably nobody can say it better than Jefferson did.
Well, you just said it very well. David Rubenstein, thank you for loaning us the Stone Declaration and for your patriotic philanthropy.
Thank you.
Great conversation.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you.
Come see it.